How deep in debt can an advanced country with a relatively stable government go?
The fundamental question of what is public debt? What does it mean for a government to be in debt to its own people? Is a question that both the left and the right are dishonest about. In this video, you're going to see both Paul Krugman, mainstream left-wing economist, and the very famous Milton Friedman, mainstream right-wing economist, being dishonest about this issue in the same terms, and I think fundamentally for the same reasons. Economics, as a discipline, is in small part a science, but it is in very large part about public relations, about the marketing of ideas. It is in part about applying common sense reasoning to social problems, but it is in large part about making your political prejudices seem like common sense, making the objectives you want to achieve in politics seem as inevitable and inexorable and unanswerable as the hard facts of the mainstream sciences, like physics and chemistry. And we all know that is something that economics is not. Paul Krugman says, think about the history shown in the chart above. Britain did not emerge impoverished from the Napoleonic Wars. Why would he even be saying this if it were true? You must know you're being lied to. Look at the chart. Look at the chart above. See where I have the red arrow? I've added the red arrow, but the chart is he's saying, oh, Britain did not emerge impoverished from the Napoleonic Wars. The government ended up with a lot of debt, but the counterpart of this debt was that the British property classes owned a lot of consols. So consols, this is a word here, basically the same as a savings bond. So at least here he's being a little bit more honest than in the quotation I gave you last week on this topic. Last time he just said, oh, debt doesn't matter because, as is the title of this article, debt is money we owe to ourselves. But here we just get a couple of adjectives thrown in. The British propertied classes were the ones who owned the debt. The British property classes were the ones who were being repaid. Not the poor, not the working class, not the middle class. So when you say debt is money that we owe to ourselves, what you actually mean is it's money that the poor owe to the rich. Isn't that what you mean? You're just being that little bit dishonest to make it seem as if the movement of resources here is morally neutral or is of no significance whatsoever. Now, the libertarians and the anarcho-capitalists and people on the right-wing side of the equation would make a different point that also matters and also has some substance. If the British property classes own millions and billions of dollars worth of these debt instruments, they have put their money into government debt. That is, by definition, money they are not using to open a pancake restaurant, to open a factory, to employ people, to buy ships and start shipping things, to do all the things the economy needs investors to do. That's money they're not using on their own education, and if they are really very wealthy people, it's also not money that they're perhaps donating to Cambridge and Oxford University to provide education for others or build facilities. All of the things the British property classes could have done with that money are not happening precisely because that money is being handed over to the government and will be paid back at a profit, that profit coming from all taxpayers, the rich, the poor, and the middle class alike. So it is not fair to say, as he says here, the title of the article, debt is money we owe to ourselves. No. Debt is money that the poor and the middle class will pay to the rich with the government as the intermediary.
What we call a deficit is simply a form of taxation.
During this period of time, England did not build the Great Pyramids. They didn't build a great egalitarian society within England. The exact same way we can look at the loss of more than $1 trillion that the United States spent conquering Afghanistan. You can look back at this period of time and look at, I don't know how much, but an unbelievable quantity of money that England spent in the Napoleonic Wars, and you can get some sense of the lost opportunity to spend that money on something constructive, on something that would improve education or well-being for the population in general, or hey, whatever. You want to build the world's biggest giant stone pyramids. You want to have one of the great wonders of the world. Something England is still to this day lacking in. These are not the things that British civilization did with its wealth during this time if they were going to go into this kind of extraordinary debt. And the argument he's offering here, which is just based on a lie, quote, Britain did not emerge impoverished from the Napoleonic Wars. Do you think that would be the perspective of anyone who was alive at that time? If we go back now, you can check the Hansard, you can check the recorded debates in the British House of Parliament from that time, you can read any history book from that period of time. Do you think if we go back and read one book with one shred of human sympathy for what people were going through, do you think we're going to find that just nobody in England was concerned that the government had just bankrupted itself fighting this war, and fighting a war that they wouldn't perhaps directly profit from? Now, let me just ask you a question. Seeing as this is supposedly a completely honest, neutral economist telling you, no, there weren't any really serious negative consequences from England going into debt and fighting this war. Can I think of any other wars that England started fighting right after this one so they could try to recoup this money? What was it that the British Empire tried to do to make back the money to fill in this debt? Does anyone remember that the British Empire included places like Jamaica, that it included India, that it included selling opium grown in India to China? Does anyone remember that they fought a series of wars after this called the Opium Wars? And the express purpose of those wars was to try to get the British Empire to break even or turn a profit. Yes, there were unbelievable long-term consequences, not just for the politics of England, not just for the politics of Europe, but for the politics of the whole world, including India and China, as the British Empire scrambled to get itself out of debt. Shame on you for lying, Paul Krugman. This is a lie in ways both shallow and profound to say that Britain did not emerge impoverished from the Napoleonic Wars. And it would be a lie to say today that the United States of America did not emerge impoverished from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
How deep in debt can an advanced country with a a relatively stable government go? A country like the United States, provided it has the political will, has enormous ability to collect taxes and to service debt. If we want to, we can do huge things. Sorry, right now we have debt, I think it's about 45% of GDP. We came out of World War II with debt that was 110% of GDP. And we worked that way down over the years. So that shows how far you can go. Now maybe that was a little different because it was wartime, but so my comparison country, I look, believe it or not, at Belgium, which has got debt which is, I think, 87% of GDP. And Belgium is, it's nothing particularly special. It's actually a little bit less stable than most most Western advanced countries. No, there's no run on Belgian debt. They're able to do that. So that suggests that we could probably in the United States add debt that was like 40% of GDP if it became necessary. That's a lot of running room. It's not unlimited. If we do this year after year after year, it can start to become a problem. But we do have substantial running room. I'm not actually just saying it doesn't matter. No Cheney-esque, the deficits don't matter. Deficits do matter, but we have $5-6 trillion to play with here.
I don't know about you, but I don't really feel like Paul Krugman is being entirely truthful with me in that clip. I feel like he's being very evasive and very abstracted in response to a really simple, direct question that he should be able to answer honestly. This isn't outside of his strike zone, right? So if he thinks the American government can keep on spending hundreds of billions of dollars per year increasing the debt, more hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money going to interest payments on debt. There must be an upper limit to that. He must have some theory as to at what point it becomes a problem. When does it become a crisis? It can't be that he believes in an infinite amount of debt. It must be finite, right? In the field of economics, we don't generally deal with simple binary questions of right and wrong, good and bad. We normally deal with ideas that are true within a certain numerical range or useful within a certain numerical range, but then become meaningless, become bizarre, become ridiculous beyond a certain threshold, after a certain point. So if his theory was, as he stated in this video from a couple of years ago, if he thought America having 40% debt to GDP ratio, so having debt 40% of GDP, if he thought that was no problem, he should now be willing to admit that there is a problem when the United States of America is over 100%. If he thought it was no problem for the United States of America to have a level of indebtedness similar to Belgium, he should now be ringing alarm bells when the United States of America has followed his advice and has caught up with Belgium and is in just as difficult an economic situation. But that's not what he says. He's been profoundly dishonest at every stage of this. And if you just compare the articles he's written over a period of 10, 15 years, you get a sense of that dishonesty. Take a look at these two charts on screen. If anyone sincerely believed that the United States of America has no problem paying $263 billion per annum just in interest payments on the national debt, if you think that's no problem, then you must be willing to admit it's a problem if that increases to $915 billion. Now, the United States is a big country. Maybe $100 billion per annum would be no problem. Okay? It would be a huge accomplishment if you could get it down to only $100 billion per year instead of $263 billion per year. But even if it were a relatively small number like that, these are enormous numbers, that would be an amount of money that every year you were asking poor people to pay, you were asking middle-class people to pay, and that fundamentally is a wealth transfer going from everyone to the rich.
What we call a deficit is simply a form of taxation. If it's not financed by printing money, it's a invisible tax on all property because you own a piece of property. But you have to figure from the future income of that property that more of it will have to be taken from taxes in order to finance this debt that is here. So and those are bad taxes. They're not wholly bad taxes, but they're not good taxes. And therefore, I would prefer not to finance by deficits. On the other hand, when people talk about how much damage interest payments are doing to the country, I want you to name me any expenditure of government that does less harm than interest payments. Interest payments don't use up any resources. There's no labor that's unavailable for something else. They're simply a transfer from taxpayers to bondholders. They do cost, dead weight cost of collecting the taxes and the effect that has on incentives. So there is a net cost. But there's no resource cost.
Last week, I talked to you about the fact that Microsoft Corporation has over 100 billion US dollars worth of government debt at the time that article went to press. So they're profiting from that. If you run a small new computer company, you do computer software, and you're not in that position, how do you feel about that? You say, hey, we work real hard to manufacture computers here, to make computer software. We're trying to compete with Microsoft. But whenever we're paying our taxes, a significant percentage of our taxes is going to make the rich richer, and it's specifically going to Microsoft. It's a little bit strange, no? It's kind of corrupting fundamental, principles of what the free market is supposed to be, whether you care about them in principle or care about them in practice or not. Let's go back to a guiding light of center-left economics, Paul Krugman. So as I said earlier, he's here questioning, he's here trying to challenge your assumption that debt is a problem because it's the current generation spending money from future generations. That's not what people mean when they speak about the burden of debt on future generations. What they mean is that America as a whole will be poorer. just as a family that runs up debt is poorer thereafter. Does this make any sense? Well, let's do a thought experiment that doesn't, at least initially, seem to have anything to do with debt. Suppose that instead of gifting seniors with debt, President Santorum passes a constitutional amendment requiring that from now on, each American whose name begins with the letters A through K will receive $5,000 a year from the federal government, with the money to be raised through extra taxes. Does this make America as a whole poorer? The obvious answer is no, not at least in any direct sense. We're just making a transfer from one group to another. We're just making a transfer from one group, people whose names are L through Z, to the people whose names are A through K. He's being extremely duplicitous here, because the reality is people who buy bonds, people who buy government savings bonds are rich. This is part of making the rich richer. Even companies, the small corner store, the small new computer startup, they are not buying bonds. Microsoft is buying over 100 billion US dollars in bonds, right? It's not a transfer that's arbitrary, that's benefiting half of the population and not the other half, okay? This is very specifically a type of transfer of wealth that goes from the poor to the rich. It goes from the middle class to the rich. And yeah, it goes from some rich people to other rich people, but in a way that's fundamentally irrational and unjust, even if all the people being taxed and benefiting from this are wealthy, which is, of course, impossible. But his excuse is total income hasn't changed. Now, you could argue that there are indirect costs because raising taxes distorts incentives, but that's a very different story. Is it really? Is that really so extraneous? His example he used before, that, nothing really changes because the British wealthy class, they just buy up this government debt. It changes things. It changes the world. It changes government policy. It created more wars, and the consequences of that war did indeed bankrupt the British government and to some extent burdened, if it perhaps didn't bankrupt, the British ruling class, right? And then that debt was repaid through the conquest and exploitation of India, through selling opium to China, through fighting more wars so that England could be the dope dealer to China, through the sugar trade and the rum trade out of Jamaica. The consequences were enormous. But invisibly, yes, the moneyed class of England had their capital, their investment potential, their innovation potential taken away from them because it was tied up in government debt. And the government itself had a constraint on its ability to spend money, to start new initiatives, to do new things. This really is part of the bankrupting of a society. You're just lying about it. It's just a straight up lie. Okay. So here's his conclusion, his inspiring conclusion. Okay, you can see what's coming. A debt inherited from the past is, in effect, simply a rule requiring that one group of people, the people who didn't inherit bonds from their parents, make a transfer to another group, the people who did. In plain English, that's called the rich get richer. Dun, 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 dun.